Hi everyone. Good evening or good morning, depending on when you're watching this video. I have a testimony for you tonight, and it's about a Jewish wedding, hence the title of the message. I had a very unique experience this week going to a Jewish wedding, and it really touched me. I thought it was a very blessed evening, a very joyous evening, and I really felt like the Lord wanted me to give a testimony about it today. So that is what I'm going to do. So the way that this Jewish wedding came about, it was actually pastor who was invited to the wedding, and the wedding took place in Brooklyn. And for those of you who don't know, there's a very large Jewish population here in New York, especially in Brooklyn. And I've heard from various sources that there are more Jews in Brooklyn than there are in the state of Israel. So there's a heavy Jewish presence here in New York. And going into Brooklyn, so the wedding was on a Monday, and going into Brooklyn from Long Island, it can be a bit of an ordeal. So I drove pastor to the wedding, and in doing that, I was also able to go to the wedding myself. So it was a very nice evening. We had a good ride there, considering we made very good time, considering we were leaving after, around work time where there's rush hour traffic and going into Brooklyn. The biggest trouble about going into Brooklyn is always finding parking. Anytime you go into the city, whether it's Queens, the Bronx, anything, on my mind, it's always about parking. I grew up where there's available parking wherever you go. And it's not necessarily parking spots, but you just pull over on the side of the road, you go up, you pull on the lawn. I mean, it was very country type driving where I grew up, and there was a traffic light maybe about 15 minutes away from where I lived, and the nearest Walmart was about a half an hour away. So comparatively, Long Island is much more populated than where I grew up. So in addition to that, I mean, when I first moved out here, I considered Long Island the city, but after all these years, I now know it's definitely not the city. It's just heavily populated like a suburb. But now going into the actual city, the biggest problem you get is finding parking. And that's like on everybody's mind. But even going in there, there's always a lot of traffic, people walking around on the streets. There's a lot going on. So despite all that, all the traffic, we got good parking, and we were a little bit late to the wedding. So there are some traditional customs that I did not get to see. However, they were kind enough to provide a wedding guide that explains some of the customs and traditions that they have there at the ceremony and why they do them. So I thought I would share a little bit about the wedding guide. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So the first 5 things I think we missed. But the sixth part, the last part, the 7 blessings, we were there for a little bit, so I got to hear a little bit. I took a video of some of what was said. But so I'll start off. Okay, so once we got to Brooklyn, we found parking. And then we walked over to the one headquarters. So this is Lubavitch World Headquarters that the wedding took place at. In this particular ceremony, it was the Chabad Lubavitch group. That's the sect of Judaism where the wedding was. I'm trying to find the right words for it, because I asked Pastor before this, the difference between Orthodox and Orthodox, and it really comes down to degrees of following the law. So this particular ceremony, the bride and the groom, they are part of an ultra-Orthodox community. So they do follow the law pretty heavily, but I would say they're more of the liberal ultra-Orthodox in relation to they're not strict about, they'll welcome, I would say, secular Jews or Jews who don't practice, who don't adhere to the law as strictly as they do. They welcome them into the synagogue. They're very open in that way. They are liberal in certain areas, but them who practice that ultra orthodoxism, they are fairly strict in their own adherence. So that being said, the wedding took place outside in a courtyard. And what I found was very interesting is that traditionally it's customary when you're outside having the wedding that you're in a Jewish community, that it's kind of an open invitation. Anybody can stop by and witness the wedding if they want to, which I found very, very nice. It was, very community oriented. Well, whether you know them or not, you are more than welcome to be a witness to this wedding, um, because they are very community oriented. So I thought that was a very beautiful aspect of the cultural wedding. And this was my first time going to a Jewish wedding. And as anybody understand, I mean, whether you have an American wedding, you always have touches of somebody's culture or tradition, heritage, even traditional weddings. Everybody does things a little different no matter what. So this particular wedding, I think a lot of their traditions are fairly similar, maybe with a few differences, but just for comparison, I don't have another Jewish wedding to compare to. I can only compare it to the American Christian weddings that I have been to. So it's outside in a courtyard. They have some rooms, they have some seating available, but if there's no seating left, then it's standing room only. So you have people down on, you have people up sitting close to the stage. And it was a very nice area as far as like outside, like just the way everything was. There were a couple seats available. I stood up in the back and I was taking some video because I wanted to be able to commemorate it a little bit and play back anything that I could hear about, what was going on. And sometimes when they do speak, even at services in the synagogue, they do it in Hebrew. And unfortunately, I don't speak Hebrew, so I can't really understand what's happening. But I can kind of get the gist when I have some sort of guide. And then they also do things in English as well, because not everybody, even in the Jewish community, can speak Hebrew and understand it. So the first thing that they do, which I was not there for, is when they have this type of wedding, they start off with their own private Yom Kippur, which I thought was very interesting. So the bride and the groom, the wedding day is seen to be the beginning of a new life as one complete soul. And I just think that was really beautiful because, yes, even in the Christian community, we understand it as, yes, you're coming together as a new soul. So when they have this private Yom Kippur, it's said that with the hour of marriage, a new and pure soul is to be theirs. So on the day of one's wedding, all previous transgressions are forgiven, and it is considered a private Yom Kippur for the couple. So Yom Kippur is the holiday that comes around every year. Yom Kippur is the Day of Atonement. So you atone for your sins, and in this private little Yom Kippur, their transgressions are forgiven, and they begin their hour of marriage as a new soul at that moment. So it starts off with a spiritual understanding, spiritual meaning, spiritual purpose behind the marriage. And then the next thing that they do is the greeting of the bride and groom. And the bride sits on a symbolic queen's throne, and it's a mitzvah. So a mitzvah is like a blessing. Let's see if I can get an actual proper definition for you. It's a commandment or a precept that you're supposed to do so many deeds. Like you're supposed to do so many mitzvahs in order to reach salvation or something like that. It's supposed to purify your soul in some way to adhere to all these commandments, but they're called mitzvahs. And they're commanded by God to be performed as a religious duty. Okay, so it's a mitzvah to honor her and make her happy. So in another room, the men join the groom, where a formal engagement is signed and read aloud. Upon the conclusion, the two mothers break a plate, signifying that just as the breaking of the plate is irreversible, so too should the engagement be irreversible. So the marriage contract that they sign is called a kasuba or a ketubah. I found two different spellings of it. One is Ketubah, and the other one is Kesubah. So it's a marriage contract, and it's a legal document dating back about 2,000 years. And at this time, it's then signed, showing that the marriage is more than a physical, spiritual union. It is a legal and moral commitment. And the groom then recites a Hasidic discourse, usually delivered by the Rebbe, exploring the elevation which the bride and groom attain through their marriage. So I thought the marriage contract in and of itself was very interesting because it's very true. And I don't think there's enough importance on it in Christian community, Christian services, that yes, the marriage, you're coming together as one, but it is a legal contract. You are making a vow, and you're making a vow before God and before your family with witnesses. And when you have this idea of an actual contract, that it becomes that much more serious. And the ketubah is actually written in Aramaic, I believe, because, yes, it's written in Aramaic, the technical legal language of the Talmudic law, rather than in Hebrew. So I just thought that was interesting as well. Because I always find, which this is just my own philosophical opinions that I formed based on just witnessing certain events in our society today, is that American weddings, they tend to revolve, and I'm talking, about Christian weddings, they tend to revolve around certain things like the ring. What ring did he get you? Well, what was the proposal? How did he propose? The dress. It's about the day. It's about the colors. It's about the floral arrangement. It's about the bridesmaids and the party at the end, the reception at the end, the dancing. The food that you eat. Seems to be about everything except for the actual roles that you're going to be fulfilling. And I found a very interesting video when I was doing a little bit of research about specific Jewish weddings. I found it on the Chabad website. It was a rabbi talking about the roles of men and women, and he was joking at the beginning. It was very funny. He was saying men and women really are not compatible. But in the marriage state, things change. Something has now changed. The marriage changes the man and the woman, and they become husband and wife. And it's like an elevation a little bit. And now your relationship is supposed to be more compatible, basically because it's not just about you anymore. You're now have moved into a particular role. You have now moved into a husband role, and you have now moved into a wife role. And your obligation is to fulfill that role and to hold your weight in the marriage. So there's a big miscommunication these days, it seems like, which I think has led down to a lot of breakdown of marriage, because people in general don't understand what their roles are anymore, because we have all this fluid gender roles and fluid traditional roles, and it's really brought some confusion into the society. But once you understand your role and what you're obligated to do, not just for you but for your family, like this is your job now, whether you like it or not, you have to uphold your end of the commitment, because not only did you sign a physical contract, but you signed a contract essentially with God as well when you do this. And I just thought it was actually, it's a very, to me, I feel like it's a very beautiful thing and it helps when you have a whole community that does it, because it's not just you doing this offshoot thing like you want to do this. It's people who are really coming together to understand what their roles are, because in this type of a marriage, in this community, it's so interesting because they don't really date a whole lot. It's they meet like maybe once, twice, three times. I don't think it's a whole lot before they make the decision that they want to get married. Um, which seems very alien to somebody from uh, outside of this community who is in the world, even a Christian in the world, because the church certainly doesn't do this. Um, it takes a while to get to know somebody, and it really takes a while to get to know somebody. Um, like personality, you kind of want to see how they handle bad situations. You want to see who they truly are before you decide to sign on to something. But in this particular community, I just thought it was very interesting that their reason for getting married is not so much about love, about this romantic love that the world talks about and wants to you get married because you love the person. But how can you really love somebody if you meet them once or twice? It's more about the the role. Both parties understand the role that they need to fulfill. If you don't understand your role, then you can't really commit to even being married. And Pastor and I have these conversations all the time about what's happening in society today and the roles and the mix up of roles, and it's very interesting, and it's such a blessing to be able to have these conversations about what's going on and what's good about this community and what this community is lacking, or and I'm not talking about this specific community, but society in general, like America in and of itself. There's so many cultures and communities here, and we used to have the idea of a melting pot where everybody would melt and blend together. So like the idea, I ideally in the United States, it's like a little microcosm of the kingdom of God. The idea of the kingdom of God in America, the foundation was essentially the same, in the sense that it doesn't matter where you come from, you can enter in. If you have a certain level of morality, you can succeed. If you have a certain level of understanding how to be honorable in business, if you have a good work ethic, in the United States, you can come from wherever. And we always wanted to attract the best of the best from any country. We wanted the best. Now our doors are open to just about anybody, and we're not attracting the best of anywhere. So we've now that whole principle has completely died, that whole desire for that. But the same is in the kingdom of God. It doesn't matter what your background, doesn't matter the color of your skin, and it even doesn't matter your education. If you work hard for the Lord in the kingdom, you can achieve. The call on your life precedes everything. So the idea, it was supposed to be to encourage and absorb the best parts of each culture, and discard the traditions that were ungodly, because everything's a mixture these days. There are traditions that are godly, and there are traditions that are ungodly, and a lot of traditions do stem from pagan rituals. So the idea to have a bunch of cultures coexisting at the same time, and to be able to bring the best out of every culture and to absorb it into one new country is like the foundation of America, which didn't succeed because the Christianity couldn't stand. It couldn't withhold all of these other foreign gods coming in. It wasn't strong enough to overcome the incoming foreign gods and traditions and rituals, and it fell. And also our leaders were bought out, which is a whole other problem. But there were such blessings from this type of this idea, the way that they look at love and the way that they look at marriage in this community. And I thought it was so fascinating. I was really blessed by it. It actually, thinking about it afterward, I got real joy from the memories of this wedding. It was beautiful. And it wasn't over the top as far as American weddings go. American weddings, it's about all of the extra things. It's about everything other than coming together as a new soul, honoring your culture, honoring your traditions, carrying this weight of a legacy of customs that have out outlived generations of your family. They've been around for thousands of years. So you have this weight on you to uphold your traditions for your family because your ancestors upheld it, and then their ancestors upheld it as well. And through everything that your community went through and has gone through and seen over the years, you've kept on to these traditions and this understanding of what marriage really is. And the marriage is more so about the roles and not necessarily about this emotional, passionate love that people have been tricked into thinking is the real foundation for marriage, because that's not true. The foundation for marriage is to come together as one and to fulfill your role and honor your spouse and to love them by upholding your end of the deal, because this world is such a rough world that there's protection in having a spouse and having family, and it gives you some protection emotionally and physically and spiritually in this world that is really crazy and cruel. And so it's not just about you, it's not just about the individual. It's about it's about you as a community, and just coming together on another level that is above yourself and what your idea of love is. Because I'm trying to remember parts of the conversation that I had with Pastor before this, because it was a really interesting conversation, blessed me tremendously, just to be able to kind of bounce ideas back and forth about what the Lord's ideal is and what the Lord is going to do and what could possibly be, appearing in the future. Like, where did the church go wrong? Where did Christianity go wrong? We look at America today, and Christians, the family structure in the country is really broken down, and that's not to say that every family is broken down, but as a large part, as a nation, you can tell that we are broken, and it's a spiritual brokenness. And it starts, I mean, if your family structure is strong, that's part of the protection against this insanity that's going on in the world today. And is your understanding of marriage and love and what your role is as a man and as a woman. And if you don't fulfill that role, then you're not fulfilling your end of the deal. And the distribution of weight in the relationship is unbalanced. And it can lead to really a not enjoyable relationship at all. It can lead to, quite frankly, misery. I mean, I've seen relationships that are good and people thrive. Marriage, it can be very happy, but when it goes bad, it goes bad. So, what does the Lord require of us in fixing see around us? Because our minds are very important in what we project, and having these conversations, it goes into the spirit, and it affects the heavens. And then anybody who taps into that stream in the heavens, anybody who's looking for truth, they can access it because it's flowing around in the heavens. So by even just having a simple conversation, a conversation in Christ, it can touch a lot of people who are spiritual, who are, asking for prayer and thinking about it, and it goes down, and you just kind of tap into that river. So just having a conversation and just wondering what the Lord requires of us in this society today. And just to ask him, because I've done the same thing, like, where am I out of order? I'm not in the correct moral order in some areas of my life, and I want to be in the correct moral order. So by witnessing this wedding that was in a community that where their family structure is intact, and not only is their family structure intact, but their idea of love and their idea of marriage has really surpassed generations. So there must be something to it. There must be some spiritual strength to it. And I want at it how the Lord wants to look at it, so that if there's anything here that can be incorporated that into the Christian lifestyle that we need, that because we're so broken, because we've gone astray, well, then I want to see it his way. So the ketubah or kasuba, however you want to pronounce it, it's a unilateral agreement, and it's actually benefits the wife. You wouldn't think of it. Sometimes when people think of, uh, other communities that tend to be this strict religious, they think of it as more patriarchal, and that the women are in bondage to the men, and et cetera, et cetera. But I found it very interesting that this particular contract actually is for the woman. So let me just read a little bit about it and tell you what it's all about. It's a unilateral agreement. It's drawn by witnesses in accordance with Jewish civil law, in which they testify that the husband guarantees to the wife that he will meet certain minimum human and financial conditions of marriage. It is not a ceremonial document of scripture or prayer. That's why it's written in Aramaic, the technical legal language of the Talmudic law, rather than Hebrew, which is the language of the Song of Songs. Neither is it a state document establishing a new relationship of man and woman. It makes no mention to the confirmation of God or of society. It's a statement of law that provides the framework of love. The ketubah restates the fundamental conditions that are imposed by the Torah upon the husband, such as providing his wife with food, clothing, and conjugal rights, which are inseparable from marriage. It includes the husband's guarantees to pay a certain sum in the event of a divorce, and inheritance rights obligatory upon his heirs in case he dies before his wife. It's not a mutual agreement, and the wife agrees only to accept the husband's proposal of marriage. And it's certainly not a bill of sale. In fact, the ketubah represents the witnesses rather than the husband or the wife. Through this instrument, they attest to the groom's actions, promises, and statements, and to the bride's willing acceptance of the marriage proposal. It's a charter of woman's rights in marriage and of the man's duties. The ketubah is designed for women's protection, and every legal nuance in this matter was developed so that her husband shall not regard it as easy to divorce her. The ketubah required money to be paid by the husband in case of divorce, and this made it difficult for the husband to divorce his wife without appropriate reflection and consideration. It protected whatever property was to be hers at the termination of the marriage. Because of this concern for the integrity of the daughters of Israel, the sages said that to live with a wife without a ketubah or without specification of fair conditions is regarded as concubinage. The difference between a wife and a concubine in that a wife has a ketubah and a concubine does not. They considered that as an unstructured marriage arrangement was fit for only a man and his concubine, that it placed the woman at an unfair disadvantage, and that it was beneath a Jewish woman to be so considered. So what I like about it, and I'm not advocating that everybody should, who's not Jewish should get a ketubah, but the idea of it is that you understand what your actions and promises and statements are. As a husband, this is what I am willing to do. This is what I think my role is. And as a woman, then you can either accept that or not accept it. And then you also have your role to fulfill as well. I mean, when I think about people outside of this community who are getting married in the church, I don't know if they talk about their roles at all. I've never heard anything like it. I've never heard anything about it. But at the end of the day, I think it's probably the most important thing to mention. as traditionally as a nuclear family, which I believe is the best family structure, it's the most successful, and I believe it is God ordained, that the man is the provider. Traditionally, he is the provider. He is the one that works. He is geared towards it. He is genetically driven to do it. He is not genetically driven to take care of young children at home. Now, the wife, the woman, is genetically designed to be nurturing and to take care of children. And she's a support system for the husband. She's supposed to make the home a home. And when your husband's out working all day and getting the stress of the world and being battered and bruised out there trying to make a living, when he comes home, the woman's job is to make a home for him, a home that is full of peace, that is a refuge that he can come home to, and he's not then going from a war out there to a war in the home that he's working hard to support. So there's supposed to be a peace in the home, and the woman is supposed to be the peace. She's supposed to make the home a home and a refuge for him, and a safe place, a nurturing place for the children to be raised and grow up in, and for the morals and the opinions of the parents to be taught to the children. And you cannot teach your morals and your opinions and your customs to your children when you have a nanny raising them, when you have them in school, because once you give them over to the school, then the school and the agenda of the school will be imprinted on your child instead. So we've got a big problem in this country, a big problem, because the roles in the household are not delineated and they're not understood, and people don't even know that they need to talk about this, that they need roles to be established in order to have some sort of familial structure. Because in this, and this is just the nuclear family, but in addition to this, then you have the extended family, and you have the aunts and the uncles and the cousins, and you have the eldership, and you have everybody getting involved. If there's an issue that arises, you are beholden to the elders. You have someone who's holding you accountable. Are you fulfilling your role? And then in doing that, you also have a last name. You have a last name that you need to uphold as well. Well, now if I'm acting out of a moral character that is reprehensible, then that goes against the name of my family, and now I have to be accountable. Now my family's going to be accountable because they share the same last name. So am I going to trash that last name, or do I have to uphold it because it's the bloodline, it's a legacy? The problem is that our generation here, we think so linearly. We think in our own in our own lifetime. We think 40, 50, 60 years. We don't think of generations ahead. We don't think of generations behind. We don't think of anything above and beyond ourselves, because we've been conditioned to live in a very selfish way since the 60s, since we individuated, and it was all about the happiness of the individual. And then we got wrecked from that point because everybody started to do their own separate things, and the family structure started to spill apart. It just split apart and fractured and crumbled. And now we're left with really unstructured homes and unstructured families, and children living in situations that they should not be living in. So I did not get to witness the reading of the ketubah, but I thought this principle was very interesting. And what I also like about it is that it provides the framework of love. Because when you ask the question, well, what is love? People have many different answers. And there's different meanings of love. You have your eros love, that's the romantic love. You have your phileo love, that is the love of friendship. You have your agape love, which is your God-like love, your Christ, the love of Christ. And then you have your familial love. I want to say, I did look it up. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but I think it's storge. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that word correctly, but that is the type of love that's found in family relationships. So you have all different types of love, and your roles in that type of love also differs. You do different things for your friends than you would your spouse, as you should, because your role is different. And in a marriage, you experience all those types of love within your marriage, because it's ideal to also be friends with your spouse, to be able to actually laugh together and share something in common. I mean, if you're building a family together, spending a lot of time together, you can't hate each other. You have to have some sort of coming together and being able to enjoy each other's companionship because you're on this life journey together. So, what is love? Love is, it can't be the Eros love all the time because that's not possible to sustain. That love is fleeting. It comes and it goes, and it's important to have, and you do have that in a marriage. But when you start out with that, you think that's like the foundation, so that when that goes away, then you think, well, my marriage is over because that's what it was based on. But if that's your foundation, then it's rocky from the beginning. But there's other types of love. People show love differently. Well, you show love with your words, you show love with your actions, you show your love by actually fulfilling your role. When you're a husband, if you don't work and support your family, you're not showing your love for your family. You're showing contempt for your family. You're showing great disrespect. You're showing selfishness and being very disingenuous with your whole purpose, because what kind of man does not support his family? And there are a lot of men out there who don't support their families properly. And as a woman, you are supposed to support your husband in the things he's doing, and you're supposed to be being that support and that rock in the home. And if you're not fulfilling your role, then your kids really suffer as well. If your husband's working and he comes home and there's no dinner, the house is a mess, the children are not disciplined, they're running all over the place. I mean, if there's no stability in the home either, then it breaks down from that point of view. So the woman is not fulfilling her role either. And so, is she truly loving her husband? Is she loving her children by not fulfilling her role? And I would say no, because that is the definition of love is, no matter how you feel or what you feel like that day, you still do the work because you have a job to do. It's more about than about your feeling that day. It's about going through the trenches and still fulfilling your role. It's still about teaching your children even if you don't feel well. It's still about honoring your husband even if he's made you upset that day. You still have a job to do because still has a job to do. And even if he's upset, he's still going to go out and work and put food on and make money so you put food on the table and make a meal. Everybody's got a job to do. The extended family has a job to do. We all rely on each other, and we're all a structure, and we all support each other. But once that family structure starts to break down, you have more weight on this side than there's resentment on this side. So this particular ketubah, the idea of the ketubah, I thought was incredibly interesting, and the framework of love, it just brought a whole other dynamic of my thinking. Because for two people to be able to enter this type of a serious contract when they've met only a couple times, to me, is incredible. Because they know that it's not about them, that they'll grow to learn about each other and respect each other, and they'll figure out who each other is eventually. But in the midst of doing that, they're going to be fulfilling their role as a husband. And it's, common courtesy goes a long way. Like, whether you know somebody or not, if you're the wife, you're going to do the wifely things and be kind and courteous in certain ways. And if you're the husband, you're going to be kind and gentlemanly in certain ways, whether you love her or not, emotionally. Because if you stop loving somebody emotionally, well, like, the love died. It's just not there anymore. Does that mean that you're not going to go to work and support her, that you're just going to let the house fall into foreclosure because you don't feel the love for her, because you're still a husband and you still have a job to do. But if you don't feel the love anymore, are you just going to let your role die? Let the house fall into foreclosure even if you have kids in there? As a husband, your position is now elevated. You're more than just a man. You are a husband. You are her husband. There is a her, there is a possessive pronoun before that word husband. Her husband, my husband, his wife. So the role is now elevated and it becomes much more serious. It's not just some flighty feeling that you can hang on to, because it's like catching wind. You can't hang on to it. It comes and it goes. But are you going to withhold your responsibilities in your position because that feeling is now evaporated? Do you do the same with your family? Well, I don't feel like I love my parents anymore. Stuff has happened. I don't get along with them well anymore. Does that mean you're just going to let them go into a home, that you're not going to help them if you need them? No. People don't do that. You still care for your family even though you're in the midst, because it's your family. Even if the relationship's broken down, it's still your family. And at the end of the day, you're going to come through for them because you love them. It might not be emotional, but you're not just going to let them go to the wolves if it's not perfect. So in the marriage, you do the same thing. You still perform your role and your obligations because it's contractual, it's a commitment. You're honoring your spouse, you're honoring your community, everybody who is there witnessing. You don't do it just for you, you do it for everybody. And I thought it was such an interesting concept that I haven't seen in anywhere else, outside of this community. But like I said, I haven't been to any other Jewish weddings, and even culturally, I've been to a Nigerian wedding, but any other cultures, I really haven't been to their wedding. So I don't know if this is a normal thing just outside of the United States. But the idea of the ketubah was very interesting. So the next part of it is the veiling of the bride. So the bride's face is veiled, and it's reminiscent of the biblical account of Rebecca's modest encounter with Isaac prior to the marriage. And it gives the bride a little bit of privacy. So there's a little bit more here, but I'm not going to read everything. The next thing that happens is the wedding ceremony under the canopy. So the wedding ceremony, it takes place under the open sky. That was where the wedding took place. It was in the courtyard. And it's placed under the open sky, recalling God's promise to Abraham that his children will be as numerous as the stars. And what I really was blessed about with this is that it's a remembrance of scripture about God's promise to Abraham. Because when you do this, when you have this understanding and you perform it at every wedding, and this is the reason why you do it, and that you say that's the reason why you do it, it's so ingrained in your community, in your society, and you're like literally living the scripture and remembering God's promise to Abraham. And when you get married and you think about it, you're under this promise, and it becomes this, like, I don't want to say obligation because it sounds bad, but you're under this understanding that what you're doing is because of something that happened such a long time ago, that God promised something to somebody else, and you're living it. So you have a responsibility. That's the word that I want to use. A responsibility to remember that your children and your community, that you're supposed to be growing your community. We have an issue here where typically Caucasian families only have like one or two, maybe three children. I think two's the average. But when you look at other countries and other cultures that have five, six kids, I mean, they're under this understanding that one, children are a blessing, and a big family, you're supposed to, it's an honor to be able to have a bigger family, that one, you could take care of this bigger family, but also that you have more children to be able to bring up in your traditions and your cultures and to be able to serve God as well. But we have this problem in the West where everybody's individuated, all of the traditional roles, everything's upside down. Abortion is abundant. So in Western civilization here, the women would rather kill their babies because they don't believe that they are a blessing from God. They don't have that understanding. They think of them as a burden. They see them as a problem. So there's a big disconnect. And that's more so, I mean, there's a lot of Christian families who do believe that babies are a blessing, and have large families and large and adopt and believe that, abortion is horrific, etc. But as a Christian community, we don't have a community like the Jewish community has. We have patches. I grew up with some family who had a lot of children, like 8, 9 children, which is great. It's hard to watch 8 or 9 children when you're just one family in the middle of nowhere. And a couple of the families that I knew they had some problems. I don't want to say it now, but they had some problems. It's hard to watch 9 children when you're on your own. But when you have a community and extended family, and you're together. You're a little bit more close knit. And plus you're also living and surrounding yourself with Torah reading and ritual. And I'm certainly not advocating for ritual, in the sense that I understand that, when ritual, if it can become a burden if you don't understand it. It can be a blessing sometimes as well, because people also need structure. So you do the ritual as a structure until you get the understanding, that a spiritual understanding, that's the ideal. You do the ritual until you get a spiritual understanding about why you're doing the ritual. And then the ritual becomes a burden at the point once you have that spiritual truth inside of you. But there's a time and a place for certain ritual, and there's a certain time and a place where that ritual becomes bondage. So it's really dependent on your relationship with the Lord. So what was I even saying? I can't even remember why I got on that topic. Okay, so I'm just going to continue. Lord, please help me remember why I started with that, if it was important. But if not, then I'm just going to continue. So, okay, yes. So family structure. So the family structure in the Christian community, we're a little bit spread out. We're not as compact as the Jewish community is. So you definitely have some Christian families who believe in having, a lot of children. But for the most part, I would say American and Western civilization, the Caucasian race is only producing like an average of 2 children per family. And at the rate that it's going, um, it's not leading to an abundance of families being raised in the Christian community versus Muslim families who are raising 5, 6 children strong in the Muslim faith. There's a big discrepancy there. And so in the Jewish community, I just found that it's a blessing that when they have their family structure, their children, they're raised in the synagogue, they're raised in their traditions and their customs, and they have an understanding of why they're doing them, and also an understanding that we've been doing this for thousands of years. And so we really have a responsibility to continue it on for other generations. And it's a blessing to have children and a family to do so. So after the wedding ceremony, that's outside. The next part is the blessings, the witnesses, and the giving of the rings. So I'm not reading everything on this guide, but what I highlighted here is that at this time, the reading of the ketubah takes place. It's read out loud in the original Aramaic. It spells out the obligations of the husband to the wife. And it's this custom recalls the wedding between God and Israel, after which Moses took the book and read it to the Jewish people gathered at Mount Sinai. So again, you have something, a custom that's done that's um, a living out of scripture, which I thought was so cool. And it's just a reminder that this marriage, it's what's really behind it, the higher understanding of it is that God has a contract with Israel, just like the husband has a contract with the wife. And so, as God's contract with Israel is very serious and life changing, the husband's contract with the wife is also life changing and very serious. So, after that, the 7 blessings is now done. And this is when we arrived at the wedding, and I got a little bit of this on video at the very end. So I just kind of wrote it up in a script of what I heard in the video because I thought it was very interesting. And I got kind of mid-sentence. So this is what I have in the mid-sentence. This is where it started. It said, reminded of their obligation to rebuild the temple in their own lives by establishing a Jewish home. It's a central tenet of our faith that the Holy Temple, destroyed over 900 years ago, will once again be rebuilt at the final redemption of Mashiach, which is Messiah. May it come speedily in our days. So, what's being said is your contract, your marriage contract, it's important because you have an obligation to build the temple in your own lives. You have an obligation to build a Jewish home. You have an obligation to continue the customs and traditions and to live as the Jewish people lived, as a reminder of your relationship with God, and that the temple, and it's always about the rebuilding of the temple. That's what they focus on a lot. And as a microcosm of the rebuilding of the temple in the natural, the microcosm is that you rebuild the temple in your own lives by building a Jewish family, a Jewish home, a sanctuary, a place where God has a relationship with his people through the people in the family. Your family, you're keeping the law and you're keeping that connection with God in your everyday lives, just as in a physical temple if it were to be rebuilt, which I thought was very interesting. And it also just goes again to point out the fact that this marriage is not so much about the people, the bride and the groom, and their love for each other because they just recently met each other, but for the greater purpose of the Jewish people, the community, the roles that they will be fulfilling as a husband and a wife. So after the ceremony and that ended, then we crossed the street into another building, and that's where they had the reception where there was food and dancing. And I was hoping to see broken plates and people flying in the air on chairs and everything. And whilst that did happen a little bit, I didn't see any breaking of plates, but I think it depends. Like, there are, Italian Jews, Sephardic Jews, Persian Jews, Russian Jews. Everybody has their own little customs. So at this particular wedding, I thought the reception was very beautiful. I just thought there was a really sweet spirit there. The bride was beautiful, and they separate the men and the women at the reception. So at the beginning, when the bride comes in, she's running through the doors, and I got a video of it, and she was supposed to be running, I guess, directly into her mother, and then they were supposed to embrace and dance. And so her mother wasn't there right away. So in the video, the first question she has is she's running through, she's like, "Where's my mom?" I just thought that was so sweet, because the moment, that you get that you're a parent and you have children, and then all of a sudden your children become young adults and young people who are also now on their next journey of marital life. It's a big moment. And this was their first child that got married. It was their eldest. So I just thought it was a very sweet moment that the first thing that happens is that the bride runs into her mother's arms to embrace for congratulations and to dance in a celebratory manner. Because the first thing that I've noticed that happens in Christian weddings is that when the bride and groom they enter, well, the men and women are not split in Christian weddings. So when the reception, they're both together. But the bride and the groom, that when they come in, they tend to like do a dance, and there's, you got to get a good video of them dancing, and the bridal party comes in, they have to dance, and there's just much more of an event of entertainment that happens there. Um, and of course, you get, the bride and the groom their first dance. I really don't even know what the groom really looked like at this wedding. I saw a side view, like a small side view from the video that I took, but at the wedding itself, I did not meet the groom. I did not really see the groom. And the reception, there all the men were on the other side, and you could kind of like look through the side. It's split, but there's two sides that you could kind of peek over at the other side and see what they were doing. But they were dancing, they were going around in the circle, and the women were also going around in the circle and dancing. And the music, it was very positive music. I couldn't understand the words, but it was very uplifting, I would say. Everybody was excited, everybody was on the dance floor. It was a very joyous occasion. Some of the weddings that I have been to, even the Christian weddings, the music is very modern music, and sometimes it aggravates my spirit. I have been to a wedding where the reception music did aggravate my spirit a little bit, so I actually had to leave for a while just to kind of get away and calm down and then come back in. It's the beat. Sometimes the beat of the music, it goes against the beat of my heart, and it's just, I don't like the music. It's like club music. I don't particularly enjoy it. But the music there was very positive. There was a great atmosphere. Everybody was very joyous and celebrating, and the bride was celebrating with the women, with her family, with her sisters, and the groom was celebrating with the men. And he's surrounded by the men. And it was so interesting that yes, they were separate, but there was also, I found, such privacy and beauty in that separation. Um, because really the celebration was not necessarily with the bride and groom themselves, but with their family and their respective communities, and with the respective genders of their communities. The women were with the women and the men were with the men. So the bride got the strength from the women, and the groom got the strength from the men. And at one point, yes, the bride was kind of up on a chair or up on something, and they were lifting her up and down, which I thought was really cool. And the groom was from Australia, so she had, an Australian flag kind of representing where her husband came from, and it was just a real unity there. Even though the bride and the groom are separate, there was a definite real unity, because what they just did meant so much for their families and for the community and for the future of their community. It was really honorable. So even thinking about it for the last couple days, I definitely feel blessed in my spirit, and I feel joy in my spirit. And overall, when I think about, what the marriage was about, I just wrote down a few thoughts that marriage is about. It's about preserving the family structure of your community. It's about upholding the traditions for your future generations, because of the legacy that has been long held before you and will be long held after you, because the traditions outlive you and a couple generations. So your traditions they don't die with the generations, they are long lasting. And so what you're contributing to is something much beyond yourself. You're contributing to a legacy. And so I really pray that that's where our thinking starts to go as a Christian nation, that we start to think not so much about ourselves, but about, and not just like our generation, our lifetime, but our legacy of our bloodline, our community, our, what we're supposed to be doing for the Lord long term, even after we have left. It's and honoring those that came before us, not in the sense of any ancestral worship, but honoring the fact that, there have been a lot of people, men and women, who have died for this country before me. So I am obligated and responsible to fight for this nation and for the things that they died for, that were so important to be upheld, and that I think are to be important and upheld for the next generation coming before me. Everything's about sacrifice. You can't have everything. You can't have your cake and eat it too. And sometimes I get, upset. I'm like, oh, I just want everything. I just want everything. But you can't have it. And that's that's when you reach a level of maturity in your life, when you realize you can't have everything, and that's okay. And you can still survive and you can still live without having everything. And actually, the sacrifice is probably going to do more for you than having everything. So let's see what else I wrote down here in my notes. So another thing that I think I may have mentioned, like the difference between American Christian weddings, is that the marriages tends to be, it's about the bride and the groom and their found love for each other, and it's the wedding day is, typically the bride's day, and the groom just really shows up. He just, pops in at 11 or 12, where the women are getting ready since 7 in the morning. But even traditionally, even American weddings traditionally are starting to break down. There's a lot more civil marriages. It's about the pictures. It's about the bachelorette party. It's about the bachelor party. It's about the ring and how he proposed. And it's about all the details of that. But once you get past the details, then the rest of your life is spent together. And it probably seems a little mundane after you get that big high of, yes, I accomplished this in my life. It's a big milestone and it's all exciting. And then you talk about it, and then all of a sudden you get into the everyday living of marital life. And then you start to realize that, what it's about. And it's about your roles. And it's confusing when you talk about your role. You don't talk about your roles. And sometimes people get married and they don't even talk about children. And then they find out in the midst of their marriage, well, one party wants to have children, the other party doesn't. And to me, that's crazy. That's just crazy how you don't talk about that beforehand, because that's a non-compromising issue. Because if you have children with somebody who really didn't want to, but did it because you wanted it, well, eventually they're going to start resenting you, because you can't take children back. Children are a lot of work and you can't undo that. So, and then if somebody doesn't have children because their spouse doesn't want to, and then they go their life without, then they'll have regret and resentment built up because they can never go back and redo that. So children are a really non-compromising issue, and really the foundation when you get to know somebody, because dating in this country is incredibly difficult and really not an enjoyable thing, I think, for most people in my generation that I've talked to. Some people may have different experiences, but I think overall dating is it's a difficult situation. It's not a fun thing to do anymore like it used to be. So, but when you get to know somebody, like the most important things that I don't know where people are getting their information from and what they're trying to, get their mentorship from. But some of the foundational things are religion and your values and integrity and your kind of outlook on life. So what I thought was a big blessing in this community is that really there's such a tight knit community that one, they don't have the question of, well, do they follow the same religion? No, because they're all in the same organization, so they understand and adhere to the same laws that the other person would do. So that's not an issue. They also are all, very educated. They're all raised in the law, and so they know it very well. And the women can go to college. They're very educated. So, and the families investigate each other. So there's no, it eliminates the risk versus marrying someone that you don't know, that you just met, and nobody knows their family, nobody knows their history, nobody can attest to their character. That becomes a little more dangerous. But in the Christian community, sometimes it's a little difficult because Christians are on different levels and we're not really organized. I mean, Catholics are Catholics. That makes it easy. But as a spirit filled person who's was raised in non-denominational church, Catholicism is very different than the Protestant church, or at least it used to be. So in a spirit filled church, being, with a relationship with Jesus is very different than the Catholic religion. So even there you have a disparity. And then even in the spirit-filled church, well, you have some Christians who celebrate Christmas and some don't. So then you have a big gap. So to be able to find somebody who shares similar values, shares the holidays that you share, has the same outlook on life and same degree of relationship with the Lord. A new Christian who's just was saved a year ago is not the same as someone who was saved 10 years ago and who's been serving the Lord for 10 years. I personally think that, and you don't have to share my opinion on this, but as a new Christian, someone who's a seasoned Christian, they're still, I wouldn't say that that's a candidate for marriage if you're on two different spiritual levels. Like a seasoned Christian should be matched with another seasoned Christian, and a beginner Christian should be matched with a beginner Christian, because your degree of relationship with the Lord is much different. Once you've been seasoned, because the new Christians have not yet been seasoned. And sometimes when you get seasoned, you may fall away. So anybody who's, going to church because, well, their girlfriend or boyfriend brought them to church, that's great. But at the end of the day, your strength comes from your own personal relationship with the Lord, and nobody can force you to get that, and nobody can force you to keep that. It's your own personal development. So that responsibility is not on anybody to make sure that you go to church. You either have it, you're either convicted or you're not convicted. You either have that relationship or you don't have that relationship. And the only thing that can keep you in that relationship is your own internal relationship with the Holy Spirit and the growth of the mind of Christ in you. So it tends to be a little different in the Christian church because even Christians are on different levels. But even as the Jewish organization, there's different sects of Judaism. You have your Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, Ultra Orthodox, and even then you have different branches. So, but for the most part, this particular community, they have other Jews in this community all over the world. So you have a large community adhering to the same laws and customs, and it definitely makes things a lot easier when you're looking at marriage and your idea of love is really shared with thousands, hundreds of thousands of people around the world. It's a huge blessing, and I just look forward to the day that Christians in their relationship with Christ, that there's a strong number of real solid spiritual believers who are really, really grafted into the word, that are spread out throughout the world. I just think that because that's what I believe is going to be coming. Right now, it's not quite established yet, but I really was blessed by looking at this community and seeing the benefits of having such a close community like this, that I really believe that the church could benefit from, without the bondage of the law that Christians have the understanding of, that our relationship with Christ is so strong that we can have the spiritual conviction without having to be under a law in order to live out, if that makes sense. So let's see if I have anything else. Yes, a couple other things, because I listened to this one video and I thought it was very interesting what this rabbi was saying on, about love and what marriage is, and marriage, what your standards are. Your standards are, you kind, one of the pillars, you're kind, you're generous, you're respectful. And that's what I think people used to be like, before our society started to break down. Like, when I go out, like, my goal is to be respectful to anybody. I don't know who anybody is. I also believe that what you give out is what you get. And I also don't think it's just a general way that I like to live, where I'm just, rude to people that I don't even know. I don't think that's appropriate. Some people think it's appropriate. Believe me, I live in New York. Some people think that's appropriate. But I don't think it's okay. I don't think it's acceptable. I don't think God wants me to live like that. So I am generally very courteous to people that I don't know. Extra thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate your help. I go out of my way to be kind, where I can. And when you live like that, if you have a spouse and you just go out of your way to be kind, I don't, nothing bad can come of that. Like, it's really just creates a good, positive environment. Okay, your spouse likes coffee in the morning, your spouse likes tea. Make them a cup of tea, make them a cup of coffee. Just, can I get you anything to drink? Are you thirsty? I'm getting up. I'm going to go to the kitchen. Can I get you anything? Have common courtesy. When you do little things like that, there creates peace in the house. So there's generosity, there's a respectfulness. You don't take stuff for granted. Oh, you're the wife, go get me this, I need you to get me that. Your spouse is not your slave, whether it's the husband or the wife. Your spouse is not your slave. You're in it together. You're in a partnership. So, and generosity, when you're married, you have to be, kindness and generosity kind of go hand in hand. Are you kind and generous with your words? Are you kind and generous with your time? Are you patient? Are you willing, is your spouse having a rough day? Are you willing to sit down there with them, even though you've had a rough day, and actually listen to them and just talk to them, and how did things go, and try to work things out with them, and see if that helps. Are you willing to do that with your time? As I was just talking to Pastor before this meeting, I was saying, people these days can't commit to an hour to go to church once a week. If you can't commit to an hour to go to church for the Lord, to develop your spiritual development, how are you ready for marriage? How can you commit to your family? How can you commit to your spouse and your kids if you can't commit to God? If you have no discipline, you have no obligations, you don't feel obligated to give your time or serve in a particular way, I don't think that person is qualified for marriage. I think a lot of people get married that are not qualified for marriage. People get married today because they don't want to be lonely. They don't want to be alone. They, their feelings lead them in one direction or the other. And they don't have the actual characteristics that are pillars for a happy, successful marriage, because the personality is immature. But when we have a relationship with God, with Jesus, He corrects our personality flaws. We go through trials and tribulations, and come out the other side, Lord willing, if we succeed, and our characters change. We understand that, no, we're not perfect. We're certainly not perfect, but we're working on it. We are a work in progress. And with his grace and his mercy, we can overcome. We can become more patient. We can become more kind. We can have more generosity in our lives. And that's extended to our spouse who's living with us. The first thing as Christians that we should be doing if we're married is, one, if the Lord did bring us a spouse, the first thing that should be in our minds all the time is that the Lord gave this person to me to help me in any particular way, whether, to help me spiritually, to help me in life, to help me in this difficult life. That person is a gift. And I am responsible to treat that gift with the care that would please the Lord. Because what would terrify me is to get a gift from the Lord and then to mistreat it. That would scare me. That would be a slap in the Lord's face. And I don't even want to think what could happen to me in that situation, because judgment is very real and it's very serious. Because also that other person is another person. And it's very important to treat people with the respect and the grace and the patience that the Lord gives to us every single day. So it's an extension, and it's an extension of his grace. And spouse is supposed to be our partner, and we're supposed to be respectful and generous and kind. And we're really not qualified for marriage if we don't have these particular characteristics built in us. And I'm not saying that you have to be perfect, that you have to be perfectly kind and perfectly generous in every area, because life is it's a lifelong journey. But at the end of the day, even just to have the understanding consciously that we're supposed to be changing and getting better, people don't have that understanding these days. People say, I want to get married. I want someone to love me for who I am. But what if who you are is not a great person? Why should somebody do that? The goal is for you to be a better person, to have more righteous characteristics. Why is it up to somebody else to love you for who you are? God gives us unconditional love. But for somebody to love you, if that's your basis, to love me with all my flaws, well, there's going to be a day, well, someday the flaws have become too much. It's too much to handle, because personality, character flaws end up being abusive to other people, no matter what. Because as humans, we are naturally abusive. And the Lord, through his righteousness that he wants to develop in us, we become less abusive. And we become perfectly righteous. But in our sinful state, we are abusive. We do things to one another all the time that's inappropriate, that hurts people indirectly, unintentionally, but it's still hurtful. The way that we use our words, the way that we phrase things, our tone, our inability to hear correction, to say, oh, that hurt me. So when you say, someone says to you, oh, what you said there, it hurt my feelings. And then your response is, I'm sorry you felt that way. That's an unkind response. That's an abusive response. That's not taking their complaint seriously. And it's not looking at yourself in an honest, genuine way, saying, maybe I shouldn't have said things like that. Maybe I shouldn't have said it in that way. I'm sorry. We are naturally abusive. So if you're not on a path to try to get better, then you're really not qualified for marriage, because you're then not qualified to raise children if you're just going to be unintentionally abusing your children through your own personal character flaws that you don't think you need to change. So the whole experience that I had on Monday brought on a lot of thoughts and a lot of new understanding and a new cultural experience, which I love. I love looking at different cultures, different ways that people do things, because I really believe that there are certain aspects of cultures and customs that could be such a blessing to another person if they're just willing to accept that, hey, that is a great thing to possibly incorporate into my own spiritual life. So when I look at something like marriage, my own understanding changes when I understand and believe that this way of looking at love and marriage is actually better than the idea of love and marriage that I had before. And I'm willing to change and see something in a different way from a different lens. So this whole experience was such a blessing to be able to witness this wedding. And I just want to take a quick look at my notes to see if there was anything else the Lord wanted me to mention. Yes, I think the last thing that I want to talk about is just the understanding that marriage is there's holiness to it, that there's sanctity in marriage, that and I had it somewhere. Give me one. That the institution in and of itself, there's protection in it, there's honor in it, and a lot of people don't see the seriousness of it, the seriousness of a vow and the seriousness of breaking that institution. So as your souls come together as one, what's serious about that is then when that relationship breaks, the soul breaks, and everything that's been extended from that soul, the procreation of children, those children came about because of that one soul. So when that one soul breaks, the soul inside of those children gets broken. And I've seen a lot of what happens to broken families when families aren't together, when they're unstructured, they are dysfunctional, and the children come from broken homes. And what happens when the children are very much involved in a divorce proceeding when they shouldn't be, and when adults behave like children and aren't taking care of the children properly and protecting them in such a time when they are going through such a spiritual event themselves that they don't realize that they're going through, that America and the Christianity and the church, because when I look at the church, I don't see much of a difference between the church and the world. The divorce rate in the church is still high, and sometimes the dysfunction of the family is just as dysfunctional as a family that's not in the Lord. So Christians, the church in America, the church in the West, has lost this idea of the sanctity of marriage, a marriage between a man and a woman, and the family structure that is created because of it. And Lord willing, I believe that we'll get back to that eventually, but I'm just teaching it into the spirit so that it's up there, it's in there, so that it's churning in the spirit and eventually coming back down, and people can, affecting people's lives in some way, shape, or form. It's creating thought forms. Because Lord willing, America is going to come around. I don't believe the Western civilization was falling. It's under judgment for sure, and I don't know what's going to rise up in its place. But the Lord is here. Jesus is here in this country, in this nation. He has interest in what's happening here. And part of this family structure is so important. It's so integral in what the church is going to become and how the kingdom of God is going to look on the earth. I just think it's very fascinating. There was such a blessing witnessing a ceremony like this. So I just thought it was so important to share it. I think that's all the Lord has for tonight. I'm just going to wait a couple minutes if anybody has any questions, comments, or anything. I'll see if the Lord wants me to say anything else, but I think that's about it. Thank you, Tony. Thank you. I hope the message was a blessing. And with that, Tony will be back. Actually, Tony will be preaching tomorrow. I think Pastor's taking tomorrow off, and then he should be back preaching next week. And Lord willing, I'll see you in another 2 weeks. And so, for anybody in the United States, Labor Day is coming up, so I hope y'all have a nice Labor Day, and I'll see you in a couple weeks, Lord willing. God bless.